The Texas sun was a living thing that day, burning, pulsing, smothering the plains in a haze of white heat. The wind carried dust that tasted of salt and copper, drifting through the yellow grass and settling on the backs of trucks crawling down a dirt road toward a fenced compound outside a small town west of San Antonio. Inside those trucks, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence, were Japanese prisoners, men who had once sworn never to live as captives. Their uniforms, once pressed with military precision, were now faded and sweat-stained. The smell of salt and rust clung to them from weeks spent crossing the Pacific, then the continent itself. No one spoke. A few shifted slightly, eyes darting to the slats in the wooden truck walls, catching glimpses of the vast American sky. It stretched forever, cloudless and cruelly blue. They had never seen land so open, so empty, so free, and it mocked them. When the trucks finally stopped, the engines sputtered into silence. The sound that followed was eerie, the chirr of cicadas, the distant bray of cattle, the soft jangle of metal spurs. The doors opened with a long groan, and the first blast of Texas heat hit like a hammer. A voice came next, calm, deliberate, and strange in rhythm. "All right, fellas, take it easy, step down slow." The man who spoke was no soldier. His hat was wide-brimmed and sweat-stained, his shirt rolled up to the elbows, a bandana tucked loosely around his neck. He looked like something from a movie, the kind the prisoners had heard American sailors describe before the war. A cowboy. Behind him stood a boy of perhaps 12, thin and sunburned, clutching a small glass bottle filled with a dark, bubbling liquid. He looked up at the Japanese men with wide eyes, curiosity written all over his freckled face. The liquid hissed softly in the heat, fizzing as if alive. Coca-Cola. The prisoners stared at it in silent confusion. Among them, a sergeant named Nakamura felt his pulse quicken. He had heard of this drink. During briefings in Saipan, propaganda officers had told them stories about America's poison, how it corroded the stomach, how it made men weak, how it was used to control conquered peoples. To drink it was to surrender one's purity. Now, here it was, offered by a boy whose boots barely touched the ground. The cowboy spoke again, his voice slow and almost kind. "You boys must be dry as a creek bed in August. Go on, take one. Ain't nothing better on a day like this." But none moved. Their eyes, dark and cautious, flicked from the bottle to the man, then to the guards standing nearby. Though the guards held rifles, they were not raised. Their postures were relaxed, even bored. It made no sense. The cowboy frowned slightly, glancing at the interpreter, a young Nisei from California brought in by the army. The interpreter repeated the offer in Japanese. "The man says you may drink. It is safe, sweet, refreshing." Still, no one reached for it. Finally, one of the older prisoners, a Navy petty officer named Tanaka, murmured something under his breath. Poison. The word carried through the group like static. Heads turned, whispers rose, and the air grew heavy. The cowboy didn't understand the words, but he could feel the tension thickening. His son looked up at him, confused. "They don't want it, Pa?" He knelt, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Guess not, son. Maybe they're just shy." Shy. That wasn't the word. Fear was closer. Or pride. The Japanese soldiers, men raised under the Bushido Code, had been taught that capture was a fate worse than death. To be alive here, under an enemy's mercy, was a living humiliation. They were already ghosts in their own minds, men without honor, and every kindness offered by their captors felt like an insult disguised as generosity. Nakamura clenched his fists, watching the cowboy's son tilt the bottle back and take a sip. The boy smiled, the sun catching in the glass. Nothing happened. He laughed, wiped his mouth, and offered the bottle again. "See? It's good." For a moment, Nakamura's world tilted. The boy's innocence, his utter lack of malice, clashed violently with everything he had been taught. But before he could think further, a guard motioned for them to move toward the barracks. The line of prisoners shuffled forward, past the cowboy and his son, through the wire gate that separated the ranch's outer fields from the compound. The boy watched them go, bottle dangling in his hand. The cowboy sighed, tipping his hat against the sun. "They'll come around," he muttered. Inside the camp, rows of low wooden buildings stretched in neat lines. They looked temporary but sturdy. There were mess halls, workshops, even a small infirmary. In the distance, the faint hum of a generator cut through the quiet. Compared to what they expected, it was paradise. But to the Japanese prisoners, it was a different kind of prison, one built not from chains but from shame. That night, as the men lay on their bunks, the air thick with heat and the smell of creosote, Nakamura stared at the ceiling. He could not sleep. In his mind, he saw the boy's face again, the ease, the laughter, the absence of hatred. It made no sense. He whispered to the man on the bunk beside him, an older schoolteacher turned conscript. "They do not act like conquerors." The man replied softly, "Perhaps that is their power." Outside, the guards walked their patrols, cigarettes glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked, and a phonograph played faintly from a guard shack, music unlike anything the prisoners had ever heard, a woman's voice, soft and distant, singing about home. The next morning came early. The prisoners were lined up in assigned work details, ranch maintenance, carpentry, field labor. The cowboy from the day before stood at the gate, greeting the sergeant in charge with a nod. "Got some strong backs here, huh?" The officer, a thin man in a crisp uniform, checked his clipboard. "They'll follow orders. They always do." The cowboy chuckled. "Don't look like much for conversation." "They're not supposed to be," the officer replied, "but they'll work." Work, it turned out, was the great equalizer. The Japanese men were marched to the open fields, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. Cattle grazed lazily, windmills creaked, and the scent of hay and dust filled the air. The cowboy gave simple instructions, pointing, demonstrating with his hands. The interpreter translated, though it hardly seemed necessary. Men who had once loaded artillery and manned ship guns now swung hammers and carried fence posts. By midday, sweat drenched their shirts. The sun was merciless, yet no one complained. It was labor, and labor meant purpose. The cowboy's son brought water in metal buckets. He was fascinated by the prisoners, by their quiet discipline, by the way they bowed slightly when handed a drink. They never looked him in the eye, but he could feel their gratitude, even if it went unspoken. When he offered them Coca-Cola again, they refused just as before, but with softer expressions. The fear had not vanished, but it had begun to crack. The narrator cuts in. By the summer of 1944, the United States held more than 100,000 Japanese prisoners across the mainland, scattered from the deserts of Arizona to the pine fields of Louisiana. Texas alone housed several thousand. These camps were built under the rules of the Geneva Convention: food, shelter, pay for labor. Yet for the Japanese, such treatment was more bewildering than cruelty. In their world, mercy from an enemy was a contradiction. Reports from the War Department show that Japanese prisoners often refused unfamiliar foods for weeks, surviving only on rice and tea when available. They distrusted everything American, from white bread to milk, from coffee to Coca-Cola. Propaganda from Tokyo had warned them that Western food was designed to corrupt both body and spirit. To drink an American beverage, especially one as emblematic as Coca-Cola, was to symbolically betray their homeland. And so, the bottles remained untouched. But Texas had its own way of wearing people down, not with violence, but with patience. Days bled into weeks, the rhythm of ranch life setting its own pace. The prisoners began to watch the cowboys work, the way they handled cattle with calm precision, how they laughed even in the heat, how they spoke to each other without rank or fear. It was discipline of a different kind, one born not from command but from competence. One afternoon, after a long morning mending fences, a storm rolled in fast from the horizon. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. The cowboy shouted instructions, the interpreter relaying each word as lightning flashed. The prisoners moved quickly, securing tools, driving cattle toward shelter. For a moment, the chaos united them. When it was over, the sky opened in a torrential downpour. The men stood soaked, laughing in disbelief at the cool relief. The cowboy's son appeared again, carrying a crate of bottles. Coca-Cola glistening in the rain. He offered one to Nakamura, who hesitated, then shook his head politely. The boy frowned, then did something unexpected. He took a bottle, popped the cap, and held it under the rain. The fizz hissed and foamed as he drank deeply, the water running down his face. He grinned, teeth white against the mud. "Good, huh?" he said softly, though Nakamura could not understand the words. For reasons he couldn't name, Nakamura smiled back. Just slightly. That night, around the camp's dim lanterns, the men whispered about the day. "The boy drank it again," one said. "If it were poison, he would be dead by now." Another replied, "Maybe poison works slowly." Laughter followed, a rare, tentative sound. Outside, the Texas night stretched wide and star-filled. Somewhere in the dark, the cowboy tuned his radio to a jazz program, the notes floating over the wire. For the first time, the Japanese prisoners did not cover their ears. Weeks later, when the trucks rolled back through the dust for another work detail, the men climbed aboard without hesitation. They knew the rhythm now, the long ride, the work, the quiet kindness. The cowboy waved as they arrived. "Morning, fellas," he said with his easy drawl. The interpreter translated. They nodded, bowing slightly. The boy was there again, always curious, always smiling. In his hands, another bottle of Coca-Cola, condensation beating on the glass. He held it out toward Nakamura with both hands, like an offering. This time, Nakamura didn't turn away immediately. He studied the boy's face, the openness, the lack of guile. The boy's father watched from a few feet away, saying nothing. Nakamura's hand twitched, then fell to his side. Not yet, but the gesture had changed. It was no longer fear. It was consideration. The boy grinned, shrugged, and drank it himself. The prisoners watched, half amused, half confused. The tension that had once defined their every breath began to fade, replaced by something simpler: curiosity. As summer deepened into autumn, the camp settled into a strange equilibrium. The prisoners worked, the cowboys supervised, and the boy, always barefoot, always dusty, became a fixture among them. He learned to say simple Japanese words: "Mizu" for water, "arigato" for thank you. The men, in turn, taught him how to fold paper cranes and tie sailor's knots. They still would not drink the Coca-Cola. Not yet. But something fundamental had shifted. The narrator returned softly, reflective. In every war, there are battles fought not with weapons, but with perception. For these men, captured halfway around the world, the greatest struggle was not survival, but understanding. They had been told that the American spirit was decadent, that its people were soft. Yet here, under the burning sun of Texas, they found labor, laughter, and a generosity that demanded nothing in return. Kindness, they discovered, could be more disarming than any rifle. By the time the cotton fields turned golden and the air grew cool, the fences stood repaired, the barns freshly painted. The Japanese prisoners had become part of the ranch's heartbeat, their silence no longer heavy but peaceful. And every evening, as the cowboy and his son packed up their truck to leave, the boy would wave to them with a bottle in hand, the fizz catching the last rays of sun. One day soon, they would drink it. But for now, they watched, and wondered what kind of nation could afford to treat its enemies with such easy grace. That question, unspoken yet ever present, lingered in their minds long after the workday ended. It was not yet friendship, but it was no longer enmity. And as night fell over the Texas plains, the boys' laughter drifted across the camp like a promise, light, innocent, and impossibly human. The days settled into rhythm beneath the endless Texas sky, the kind of rhythm that slowly wears down the edges of men. Each morning began before sunrise, the horizon bleeding pale pink over the mesquite trees, the air cool and still before the sun began its punishing climb. The Japanese prisoners lined up with quiet precision, heads bowed, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. The guards gave soft commands, though they rarely needed to. These men obeyed instinctively, not out of fear, but habit, a discipline carved deep into bone long before captivity. The cowboy, whose name was Frank Callahan, watched them from the shade of his truck, hat tilted low, coffee steaming in one hand. He had worked with German prisoners the year before, loud, joking men who sang as they worked, who treated the war as some distant storm already past. But these new arrivals were different. They moved like ghosts. Their faces betrayed nothing, their gestures spare, their voices rarely heard. "Quiet bunch," one of the ranch hands muttered as they watched the line of prisoners begin repairing the fence. "Quiet ain't bad," Frank replied, watching the men work with surgical precision. "Means they know what they're doing." And they did. The Japanese prisoners took to ranch work with the same intensity they had once given to military drills. They studied everything. The way the cowboys tied knots, how they balanced on fence rails, how they coiled wire or mended posts. Every motion became deliberate, purposeful. Yet even as sweat poured down their necks and their hands blistered, they never cursed, never joked, never loosened the invisible armor of restraint that wrapped around them. At lunch, when the bell rang and the workers gathered beneath the shade of a large pecan tree, the differences became clearer. The cowboys sprawled on the grass, laughing, passing around tin cups of coffee and bottles of Coca-Cola that hissed and fizzed in the heat. The Japanese prisoners sat apart in ordered rows, each man unpacking his ration neatly, bowing his head before eating. When offered coffee, they shook their heads. When offered the Coca-Cola, they turned away completely, faces expressionless but eyes wary. The interpreter, a Nisei corporal named Daniel Mori, tried to bridge the gap. He explained softly in Japanese, "It is not poison, it is a sweet drink, American, very famous." But the older men shook their heads. One murmured, "That is their trick. They make us soft, then laugh as we fall." Mori sighed. He had heard the same thing before, from Japanese prisoners in Arizona, from others in Arkansas. They all carried the same ghost stories, rumors whispered on ships and in transport camps that the Americans laced their food with chemicals to break a man's spirit. The Coca-Cola, dark as oil and fizzing like acid, became the perfect symbol for everything they feared. The cowboys noticed their refusal, though they didn't understand it. Frank's young son, Tommy, found it fascinating. He was 12, curious in the way only a boy raised on stories of faraway wars could be. He had seen Germans before, but these men were something different, smaller, sterner, wrapped in silence. Their discipline both unnerved and intrigued him. That afternoon, as the men rested from the sun, Tommy ran up carrying a bottle of Coca-Cola cold from the icebox. He held it out to the nearest prisoner, grinning. "Here," he said, "you can have mine." The prisoner, a wiry man with sharp eyes, recoiled as though struck. He spoke rapidly in Japanese and the others murmured, their voices tense. Tommy froze, bottle in hand. Frank stepped forward quickly, laying a hand on his son's shoulder. "Easy now, son," he said gently. "They don't mean no harm." The interpreter approached, explaining in quiet tones, "They think it is poisoned." Frank blinked. "Poisoned? That's nonsense." Maury shrugged helplessly. "It is what they've been told." For a long moment, father and son stood staring at the group of men, the bottle dripping condensation between Tommy's fingers. The boy looked up at his father, confusion clouding his face. "Why would they think that?" Frank sighed. "Because that's what war does. It fills a man's head with lies till he can't tell the truth even when it's staring him in the face." He knelt beside his son, took the bottle, popped the cap with his belt buckle, and handed it back. "Go on, take a sip." Tommy hesitated. "But just do it." The boy raised the bottle to his lips and drank, the fizz crackling loudly in the quiet air. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and grinned. "See? Still alive." The prisoners watched, their expressions unreadable. The same wiry man who had flinched earlier stared at the boy for several seconds, then looked away. The moment passed, but something subtle shifted in the air. Over the next few weeks, the prisoners settled into the rhythm of ranch life. They worked with quiet diligence from sunrise to dusk, hauling hay, repairing fences, tending the cattle. The cowboys learned that these men, for all their silence, were meticulous workers. When told to fix a section of fence, they rebuilt it stronger than before. When handed tools, they cleaned them after use and returned them polished. "Their machines," one ranch hand said, "never stop, never complain." Frank nodded. "Machines maybe, but machines with pride." It was true. Even their discipline was laced with pride, a determination to show their worth through labor since words were useless. Sometimes, Frank found them standing at the edge of the pasture after work, staring at the setting sun. They never smiled, but their eyes softened, reflecting something like wonder. The open sky of Texas had a way of humbling even the proud. At night, back in the camp, the men spoke quietly among themselves. Nakamura, the sergeant, often led the conversations, his voice calm but firm. "We cannot let their kindness deceive us," he would say. "We are soldiers still, even here." But another man, Tanaka, would reply, "They do not act like conquerors. They do not mock us." "That is their strategy," Nakamura said. "They win without battle. They make us forget who we are." Yet, even as he spoke the words, doubt had begun to creep into his voice. The cowboys' laughter, their respect for work, their easy generosity, it didn't fit the image he had carried across the ocean. The narrator's voice breaks through the dust and heat. Across the United States, Japanese prisoners faced the same bewildering contradiction. They had expected brutality, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they found discipline wrapped in decency. According to records from the War Department, many Japanese POWs in Texas worked side by side with civilians, repairing fences, harvesting crops, or tending livestock. They were paid in tokens, allowed to write letters, even given books to study English. Yet their code of honor, rooted in the belief that capture was shameful, made them distrust every act of kindness. To accept American hospitality felt like surrendering twice, once on the battlefield and again in spirit. Back on the ranch, the lines between captor and captive began to blur. One morning, a cowboy's horse threw a shoe, sending sparks across the dry ground. Before anyone could move, one of the Japanese prisoners stepped forward, crouching to examine the damage. Without asking, he began gathering tools. Within minutes, he had reset the shoe with deft, practiced movements. Frank watched, impressed. "You've done this before," the interpreter translated. The man nodded once. "Horses, in Hokkaido," he said haltingly in English. "Same work." That was the first full sentence any of them had spoken to Frank. He smiled. "Good hand to have around." The man bowed slightly. "Good horse," he replied, almost shyly. From that day on, the ice between them began to crack. It started with small gestures, shared tools, exchanged nods, brief smiles. The prisoners began to mimic the cowboys' habits, rolling up their sleeves, wiping sweat with the same careless ease. When the men rested beneath the trees, the cowboys sometimes passed around cigarettes. The first time, no one accepted. But a week later, one did. He took it, studied it, and after a long pause, lit it. The smoke curled upward, and the cowboys grinned. It was progress. Still, the Coca-Cola remained untouched. The drink had become a symbol of the divide, of everything foreign, sweet, and dangerous about America. To the cowboys, it was comfort. To the prisoners, it was corruption in liquid form. Late that summer, Frank noticed something else. The boy, Tommy, had become their unofficial ambassador. He brought them water during the day, sometimes sat nearby while they worked, sketching in the dust with a stick. The prisoners tolerated him, even seemed amused by his curiosity. One afternoon, he drew a picture of a horse and showed it to them. The men studied it gravely, then one of them took the stick and added a mountain behind it, Mount Fuji, drawn from memory. Tommy's eyes lit up. "That's Japan," he said softly, though they didn't understand. But they nodded anyway. That night, Frank found his son still awake, staring out the window toward the camp lights. "They ain't bad men, are they, Pa?" Frank leaned against the doorframe, silent for a moment. "No, son. Just men on the wrong side of a bad storm." The work went on. Days blurred together in the heavy rhythm of labor. The prisoners grew stronger, darker from the sun, their once stiff movements easing into the unspoken rhythm of the land. They learned to whistle commands at cattle, to ride the old ranch mules, to use English words like rope, nail, fix. Sometimes Frank caught them humming, soft, strange melodies that drifted through the air like wind through bamboo. The cowboys didn't understand the words, but they listened, quietly respectful. The narrator's voice returned, soft and reflective. By the late months of 1944, Japanese POWs across America had begun to adapt to their strange captivity. The War Department noted that productivity on farms and ranches increased sharply wherever they were sent. Their discipline, so feared in war, had become an asset in peace. Yet beneath the surface lay a deeper transformation, one of perception. The Americans saw that these men were not fanatics, but workers, fathers, farmers. The prisoners, in turn, saw that the Americans were not the demons they had been warned about. In Texas, where the sky seemed endless and grudges short-lived, humanity had room to grow. By August, the heat reached its peak. The fields shimmered like glass. On one such day, after hours of hauling hay, Frank brought out a crate of Coca-Colas, the bottles clinking cheerfully. "Cold ones," he said with a grin, popping one open. He motioned for the interpreter. "Tell 'em they've earned it." Maury repeated the words. The prisoners hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Frank's son stood beside him, holding a bottle of his own. The boy smiled, raising it in a silent toast. Nakamura stared at the fizzing liquid, its brown bubbles rising like tiny ghosts. The air hung thick with tension. He could hear his own heartbeat. He wanted to believe it was safe, wanted to believe in the boy's innocence, but the fear, the pride, the training all held him back. He shook his head slowly. The boy didn't seem disappointed. He simply shrugged, took a long drink, and grinned again. Maybe next time. Frank watched them walk back toward the barn, the sun a molten coin sinking behind the hills. He turned to his son. "They'll come around," he said quietly. "Some things just take time." In the weeks that followed, time did its work. The distance between the two worlds, between East and West, pride and mercy, silence and laughter, began to shrink. The cowboys no longer saw prisoners. The Japanese no longer saw conquerors. They saw men who worked the same dirt, sweated under the same sun, and slept under the same wide sky. But even as trust took root, one symbol remained untouched, the Coca-Cola, still unopened, still gleaming darkly in the heat. It sat at the edge of every meal, every offering, a quiet reminder that some walls, even when cracked, take time to fall. And though none yet knew it, the day was coming when one small act, a boy, a bottle, a sip, would tear that wall down completely. The heat had weight that day. It clung to skin, soaked through shirts, shimmered above the fields like invisible fire. The air smelled of singed hide and smoke, of dust kicked up by hooves and the faint metallic tang of sweat. It was late afternoon, and the branding was finally over. The cattle stood penned, restless, the ground littered with footprints in the fading steam of the iron. The men moved slowly, drained, faces streaked with dust and soot. Frank Callahan pulled off his hat and wiped his brow with a rag that had long since given up pretending to be clean. His shirt stuck to his back, every breath dragging through lungs filled with the smell of summer and smoke. "All right, boys," he called, his voice rough but cheerful. "That's the last of 'em. Let's cool off before we cook alive." He waved toward the shade of a large oak tree where a crate sat waiting. 24 glass bottles, their sides sweating beads of condensation. The ice inside the crate was already half melted, the water fizzing faintly where it met the metal caps. Coca-Cola. Tommy, his son, crouched nearby, fishing one out of the slushy mix. The hiss of the cap breaking free sliced through the stillness. He took a swig, sighing dramatically. "Cold," he muttered, tilting the bottle toward the sky. "And perfect." Frank grinned, then turned toward the group of Japanese prisoners standing a short distance away. They had worked harder than anyone, their movements precise even under exhaustion, their discipline unbroken. Dust clung to their uniforms, and sweat darkened the fabric, but they stood in formation still, quiet, waiting. Frank gestured to the crate. "Come on, fellas," he said. "Y'all earned it today." The interpreter, Daniel Mori, repeated the offer in Japanese. The prisoners exchanged looks, hesitant, wary. A few murmured to each other. The same wall that had stood for months still held. They bowed slightly in thanks but did not move forward. Frank sighed. "Ain't poison, I promise," he muttered, half to himself. Maury smiled faintly. "They know that now," he said softly. "But knowing and believing aren't the same thing." Frank nodded, understanding. The boy looked from one group to the other, brow furrowed. "They still think it's bad?" "Not bad," Maury explained, searching for the right word. "Just foreign. To them it's not food, it's an idea, a strange one." The silence stretched, the wind shifted, stirring the dry grass. A few flies buzzed lazily around the empty brand fire. The moment hung suspended, fragile. Then Tommy stepped forward. He didn't look to his father for permission. He simply grabbed a bottle, flicked off the cap with the practiced pop of someone who had done it 100 times, and took a long, exaggerated sip. The fizz crackled in the air. He wiped his mouth, turned toward the prisoners, and grinned. "See?" he said, his accent thick, his voice innocent. "Ain't poison," Maury translated, though he didn't need to. The boy's tone, his gesture, said everything. For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stood frozen, caught between disbelief and something they hadn't felt in months: curiosity. Then one of them, an older man with a weathered face and deep-set eyes, stepped forward. He had been a petty officer in the Imperial Navy, captured off the coast of the Marianas. His name was Hiroshi Takeda, though few outside the camp knew it. He studied the boy for a long time. Frank watched, every muscle in his body tense but still. The old man took another step. He spoke in halting English, his voice low. "Boy, not die?" Tommy blinked, unsure how to respond, then smiled wider. "Not yet," he said. A flicker of amusement passed over Takeda's face. Barely there, but real. He looked to the other prisoners, then back at the crate. Slowly, cautiously, he reached down and picked up a bottle. It was cold in his hands, the glass smooth, the label bright red against the brown liquid. He lifted it close to his face, studying the strange American script. He looked again at the boy, then at Frank, who gave him a slow nod. With a small hiss, he opened it. The sound startled him. The fizz rose, tickling his nose. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then, without ceremony, he drank. It was sweeter than he expected. Colder, too. The fizz burned his throat in a pleasant way. His eyes widened, then narrowed as if testing for poison. None came. Only a strange warmth in his chest, not from danger, but from relief. The men around him watched intently. Takeda took another sip. Then, in an act that carried more weight than words, he gave a short nod. The reaction was quiet at first, just murmurs, exchanged looks, uncertain laughter. Then, one by one, others stepped forward. Another bottle opened, then another. The fizzing chorus rose, filling the air like music. The cowboys, leaning against the fence, began to smile. Tommy clapped his hands once, triumphant. "Told you!" Maury laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You did, kid. You did." The prisoners sat beneath the tree, each with a bottle in hand. Some sniffed it cautiously before taking their first sip. Others drank in silence, eyes closed, savoring the cold sweetness that cut through the dust and fatigue. The sound of laughter, real, unguarded laughter, rose for the first time from that group. Frank stood beside his son, watching. "You see that, Tommy?" The boy nodded. "Yeah." "That right there," Frank said softly, "is what peace looks like." The narrator's voice enters, quiet and deliberate. Moments like this happened across America in the final years of the war, too small for headlines, but vast in meaning. On ranches and farms, in canteens and work details, men who had once sworn to die rather than surrender were discovering another kind of strength, the courage to accept kindness. The Coca-Cola, more than just a drink, became a symbol of America's abundance and innocence. To drink it was to taste the impossible idea that mercy could exist without weakness. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky gold and crimson, the field grew still again. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, the day's work done. The prisoners lingered beneath the tree, bottles empty but spirits lifted. The barriers built by pride, fear, and propaganda had cracked. Frank handed his son another bottle, watching him turn it thoughtfully in his hands. "You reckon they'll ever go home and tell folks about today?" Tommy shrugged. "Maybe," he smiled. "Maybe they'll tell 'em Coke's not poison." Frank chuckled. "Maybe they'll tell 'em Americans ain't either." That night in the barracks, the prisoners spoke quietly. The sweet aftertaste still lingered on their tongues, mingling with the faint smell of hay and cedar. For months they had held on to the idea that kindness was deceit, but the boy's gesture had shattered that illusion more cleanly than any speech could. Takeda sat by the window, looking out toward the ranch lights. The stars above Texas were different from those over Japan, brighter, closer, infinite. He thought of his family back home, of his sons, and wondered if they would ever understand what had happened today. He whispered softly in Japanese, "Perhaps the enemy we feared does not exist." The others nodded, their silence filled with understanding. In the following weeks, the change was visible. The prisoners smiled more often. They greeted the cowboys with small bows that carried real warmth. They no longer sat apart at lunch. When Frank brought out the bottles again, there was no hesitation. They accepted, laughed, even toasted with clinking glass and shy grins. Tommy became their favorite. They taught him Japanese words, showed him how to fold paper cranes from scraps of feed sacks, how to sharpen tools with precision. In return, he showed them how to throw a lasso, how to skip stones across the water trough, how to whistle like a Texan. The fence lines between them became markers of work, not division. The narrator returns, reflective now, voice steady with quiet truth. By the spring of 1945, more than 100,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held across the continental United States. Most had been captured in the Pacific and shipped thousands of miles to a country they knew only through propaganda. They expected cruelty. Instead, they found structure, food, and a strange mercy that confused them more than fear ever could. Many later admitted that this contradiction, the gentle strength of their captors, did more to change their hearts than any battlefield defeat. The Coca-Cola was not the cause, but it became the emblem, a small, sparkling proof of a nation's confidence, a people so sure of themselves they could afford kindness even to their enemies. When word of the war's end finally reached the camp, the reaction was silence. No celebration, no anger, just the heavy understanding that the world they had known was gone. The prisoners would soon return to Japan, but they would not return unchanged. On their last day at the ranch, the trucks came early. The men packed their meager belongings, letters, carved trinkets, a few folded paper cranes. Frank shook hands with each of them. The boy stood beside him, solemn now. Takeda approached last. He bowed deeply, then held out something wrapped in cloth. When Frank opened it, he found a small wooden carving of a bottle, shaped from a piece of scrap pine. On it, in careful handwriting, were 2 English words. "Thank you." Frank looked up, eyes soft. "You sure you want to give this away?" Takeda smiled faintly. "We have the real one here," he said, tapping his chest. The trucks rumbled to life, engines coughing dust into the morning air. The men climbed aboard, waving through the slats. The boy ran beside them for a few yards, waving back, until the road curved and the trucks vanished into the horizon. That night, the ranch felt quieter. The fields were the same, the sky the same, but something invisible had shifted. The war was ending, but the lesson remained. Years later, in Japan, Takeda told his grandchildren the story. He spoke of the Texas sun, the wide plains, and the boy with the bottle of Coca-Cola. "We thought it was poison," he said softly, "but it was only sweetness. We thought they were monsters, but they were simply men, strong enough to forgive." The narrator closes. History remembers battles, treaties, and dates, but sometimes the truest victories are smaller, quieter. On a Texas ranch in the final years of the Second World War, a boy and a bottle bridged the unbridgeable. The first sip of Coca-Cola did not just quench thirst, it dissolved fear. It turned shame into dignity, suspicion into laughter. And long after the last prisoner left, the story lived on, passed from soldier to soldier, from prisoner to child, from one generation to the next. Proof that even in the shadow of war, a simple act of trust can taste like peace.